Are you going to spread out a little now, or how should we rearrange it? Just we'll try to observe a little bit of protocols. We can push the harmonium up a little bit, then it gives a little room for someone to sit there if they want. Yeah, thank you. Beautiful. You can put it right on the plate, that white plate, that white marble plate. Yeah.
Now you look like Mahayogananda. Swami Mahayogananda.
He was masculine.
Yeah, with the mask we could have.
That's the question. What is it that makes us who we are? That's what we're going to talk about today. Just who do you think you are? So it's great to see all of you. And today our topic is, just who do you think you are? Or alternate topic, alternate title is re-imaging our identity. I'll start with a chant. So we already had the beautiful chanting. Om Tadekam smaramas tadekam bhajamaha tadekam jagat sakshi rupam namamaha sadekam nidhanam niradambamisham bhavam bodhikotam sharanyam vrajamaha. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. On that alone do we meditate. That alone do we worship. To that alone, the witness of the universe, do we bow. To that one who is our sole eternal support, the self-existent Lord, the raft to safety across the ocean of this world, do we come for refuge. Om, peace, peace, peace. So, today I would like to take up the topic of who we think we are, our identity. Because it turns out it's a very important part of life. Actually, to function in the world, we happily and effectively, we need a stable identity. And in spiritual life, who we think we are is tremendously important and determines to a large extent the progress we make in spiritual life and the path we undertake and all of that. So it's a really important topic, and this idea of identity, how we conceive of ourselves, how we think of ourselves, how we present ourselves to others. The nature of this world is change. It's constantly changing. Nothing remains the same, except we think that our identity remains the same. If we go back to our earliest childhood memory, let's take a moment and think of a very early childhood memory. That time our bodies were very different, probably about this high, right? And very small, and our minds were not very developed. We hadn't learned algebra, we hadn't learned English perhaps, and yet we can remember and we think, that was me. That was me. Though, if we compare the me now and the me then, there's so much that's different. Yet we still feel, that was me. We see an old photograph, old family photograph maybe, mom and dad, and we were 4 or 5 years old. That's me. So in what sense is it me? Who is the me that remains the same? There's this continuity of identity. We feel we're the same person, though there's so much different. We feel we're the same person. The body is, there's what we call an autobiographical memory, which connects that child with who we are today. So there's this continuity, and yet we see that there's so many ways in which we are different. So what is it that holds it all together? Who is conscious of all those memories? And who connects them all together? Who witnesses all of that? So right at the beginning, at the outset, if we contemplate this, we start to get an inkling, a hint of a deeper sense of who we are, a witnessing consciousness in whom all these experiences have unfolded. Those experiences as a young child, going through school, growing up, family, marriage, getting old. Now, for some of us, coming towards the last stretch of life. Pay attention to that one who notices all that one who sees all that, who experiences all that. That gives us a little hint of our Jivatman, the individual soul who passes through life after life and accumulates all these experiences. That's the individual soul. Vedanta says that's not yet our true identity, but that is it's one step closer to our true identity from what we usually take to be our identity. And as we'll see, what we think of as identity as something stable and solid and unchanging actually is nothing of the sort. It's a conglomeration of different roles and streams of thought and feeling, all loosely tied into one and tied to this body. So it's interesting to look at the stages of identity development. The infant, as a young infant, is completely bonded with the parents, and especially the mother. And apparently there's no real sense of separation at first between the infant and the mother. It's just one experience. And the infant perhaps doesn't even realize that, well, here's where my body ends and my mother's body begins. There isn't that consciousness. In fact, the mirror test, in which a child recognizes her own reflection in a mirror, that doesn't start until, well, at 18 months, about half of infants, half of very young children, pass the mirror test. So still only half can recognize their reflection at 18 months. By 24 months, it's 65%. Human beings are almost the only beings that pass this test. There are a few animals, apparently elephants have been shown at times to pass the mirror test, and possibly dolphins. Kind of, how do you test whether an elephant can recognize its reflection? They paint a mark on the elephant's forehead, and then they paint another mark with translucent paint or something, so it doesn't show. And they show the elephant in a very large mirror, and apparently the elephants will touch that mark that they can see in the mirror, but they won't touch the one they can't see. So that's an evidence that an elephant can recognize its own reflection.
I don't have to see the mirror.
So then the identity of the child begins to develop. And a skilled parenting provides love, provides positive feedback, provides boundaries, leading to the development of what we call a healthy ego and a healthy self-esteem, a positive regard for oneself. Now, unskilled parenting, alas, very often results in a profound sense of insecurity for the child and shame, poor self-esteem, a negative view or regard for oneself. And this is a tragedy that we find so many people have a poor self-esteem. They don't have a positive sense of who they are. If some of you like to move a little, you could sit here. Those who are sitting on the floor, you can come up a little closer. Leave a little. We're filling up today. So this self-esteem is largely based on parental love, on the support of parental love, and on competence. If we evaluate ourselves against certain criteria that we have, say, and those criteria are often given by our parents, say our parents expect us to get an A+ on every test, then that's a criterion we hold for ourselves. I have to get an A+. If I don't get an A+, then I feel terrible about myself. Right? If I get an A+, then my criteria, it matches. So be careful what criteria we give to our children. Are they reasonable? Can they actually meet them? So no parent is perfect. We're all learning, and parents learn the art of parenting as they're doing it. There's no doubt about that. But when there's significant family dysfunction, as adults, what we need to do is reparent that little child which is still there in our psyche. We have to reparent it and teach it how to have a positive regard for itself, how to have a positive sense of who she or he is. Now, why am I mentioning all this? Well, because we know in Vedanta that spiritual realization comes as we transcend our ego. So what does it matter about the ego? Well, it matters because that ego needs to be stable and well integrated in order to transcend it. It's a kind of a paradox. We have to have an ego in order to lose it. If our sense of self is weak, then there's actually no sense of self to transcend. It still hasn't developed. It's like well, I'm not sure if I can think of the right simile. I'm just thinking that before the sense of self is developed, we may have a certain openness and expansiveness of our consciousness, But that is an undeveloped consciousness. Then the ego develops, it becomes strong, we feel ourselves to be separate, we feel ourselves to be an individual, and then we have to transcend it also. So you can't skip the middle portion. That's an important point to understand. So there is a place for psychotherapy in our spiritual life if we have certain strong hang-ups from our childhood or from other traumatic experiences in life. We need to work on releasing those so that our sense of self is stable and integrated, and then it becomes easy to transcend it. Now, adolescence is when the identity formation really starts to solidify. And there are 4 stages outlined by the psychologists. The first stage is called diffusion. That is when the person gives up trying to form an identity. An identity has never really formed, a strong identity has not formed, and the child has given up trying to form it. So it's a kind of tragic case. Sometimes we see people who we call them lost souls sometimes, people who just seem to be lost. They don't know who they are, but they've given up trying to find out. The second stage, they call it a moratorium. This is a stage of experimentation, and all young people go through this, and you'll see some people, they experiment with different kinds of hairstyles or hair colors or mohawks and you name it, tattoos. These are all part of searching for an identity, establishing an identity. And some people may go through various ones. For a while they decide, I'm going to wear all black. And then after some time they go for some other wardrobe. So this is a natural part of growing up. There's what's called a foreclosed identity, when the person has committed to an identity, but it's an identity provided by their parents. My grandfather was a doctor. My father is a doctor. My mother is a doctor. Of course, I'm going to be a doctor. I'm a doctor. I'm going to study to be a doctor. I'm going to be a doctor. That's a foreclosed identity. It may not suit the person at all to be a doctor. But my grandfather, my great-grandfather, my grandmother, my parents, all have been doctors. I have to be a doctor, of course. So that often leads to trouble later. Midlife crisis maybe, when the person realizes that they became a doctor, though it didn't really suit them. They just became a doctor because it was expected. So we ought to be careful when raising our children not to force what we think their identity should be, what we think who they should be, on them. And as young people growing up, we should also recognize that we find our own identity. We don't have to. Certainly our parents have a big influence on that, but we have the freedom to determine our own identity according to our own nature and our own samskars, our own tendencies. And then the 4th stage of identity formation, identity achieved. One has made a commitment to certain goals, certain beliefs, and certain values. And this is the healthy identity as it forms. And this identity, as we continue to grow older, it becomes stronger and more stable, and also we can say calcified. It becomes harder to change it. And yet, we see that it does continue to change. Now this identity, who we believe ourselves to be, is incredibly complex. And we can do a little thought experiment of, say, take a young girl. And she's a baby girl, and she has a name. And that's one of the first parts of her identity, is her name. Dale Carnegie's famous quote, "A person's name is to that person the sweetest and most important sound in any language." He used to emphasize we should remember people's names and use it. People love to be called by their names. If there's a cacophony of sounds in a room, say before we started our talk and everybody's talking, if someone across the room says your name, you'll hear it out of all the noise. You'll hear that, and that's me. They're talking about me. So our name has a strong, our identity, there's a strong component of identity simply in our name. And that's why changing our name can also be a very profound statement and profound step in life. We monks, we change our names when we become monks. New identity. So, so the girl, she's a daughter. She has that part of her identity. She starts going to school. She becomes a schoolgirl. She has friends. She's a student. She has friendships. Her beliefs are forming about many things about this world. There are societal influences on her. She has a female body. There are also societal pressures like racial, ethnic pressures, and that affects how our identity forms, whether we are from the dominant race or from a subordinate or oppressed race, whether people, she may start to think of herself as beautiful or ugly, as fat or thin, as smart or stupid. All these things may start to form how she thinks of herself. Gradually she goes to college, she becomes a college student, and she decides to study medicine after all, and she becomes a doctor. So she's still all those other things, she's still a daughter, and she still has those beliefs, but now she's a doctor also, and she gets married, and so she's a wife, and she gets children, and so she becomes a mother. Then she joins a political party. And as we know in this country, that forms a big part of many people's identities. Their identity, they strongly identify with a particular political party. And she joins a church or a temple or a mosque. And that also, so we see all these become part of her identity. And yet, they're different roles she plays in different aspects of her life, and they're not one, they're different roles, yet all cobbled together in her identity. When she's at home with the kids, her identity as a member of a particular political party, it doesn't really play a role. And yet they're all woven together. She has this family roles, cultural, personal, professional identities, and it continues to change. And gradually she becomes a grandmother. She retires, she's a retired person. Her husband dies, she becomes a widow. She becomes aged and infirm in body, all these changes. And she starts to think of herself as an old lady. It's interesting to realize that a good portion of our identity is based on, of course, on what we think of ourselves, and also what we think other people think of us, how we think other people see us. And a lot of our identity formation is also how we want others to see us. Note that it's not how other people actually see us, it's how we think other people see us, which is different. And that's called the looking glass self, our identity in relation to others. And there's a relatively new identity that many of us form. This is called a cyber identity, an online identity, yes. And many people invest a lot of time and energy into developing their identity on the social media platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat. Which ones do you use? Huh? Hangouts, okay, good. So, yes, we develop identity, which pictures we put up there and all these things. And it's all in some kind of, they call it the cloud. Where does it exist? It doesn't exist anywhere, actually. And yet we become identified with that as well. So, all this identity, it's a struggle to feel ourselves to be separate from others and to develop our own sense of who we are. And a healthy integrated identity, as I mentioned, is essential for living an integrated life. But we also cling to this identity. And we think and we try to feel that it is permanent and unchanging, and we want to find it and fix it in stone. And as an outcome also, if that identity gets threatened a little bit, what do? We have to defend it. We have to defend it. And we see that especially in this, in the political arena in this country, between especially, the two sides. We don't have to mention their name. We know that if you're identified with one side and someone says something that reveals that they're a member of the other party, immediately, right? Immediately. That's what happens. It's tragic. It's tragic. I'm just noting that this is a problem that comes because we cling to our identities and we want to defend them. So much of our problems actually are related to this, strongly clinging to our identity, thinking that this little self who happens to be a member of this party and this church and this family is who I really am, holding on to it as some kind of absolute. And the irony is that identity is always changing. When I was a teenager, up until about in the young 20s, I had long hair. It was down to my shoulders. I used to tie it back in a ponytail. And I really liked my long hair. In fact, I thought it really was me. It really expressed who I really was. And I was sure that I would never cut my hair. I used to think to myself, I'd look in the mirror and see my long hair and say, I'll never cut my hair. So we see it changes, right? It changes. So as we cling so strongly to this limited identity and we think that that's who we are, in fact, that is who we are, that is who we become. We think so strongly that I am this person with these all these roles and likes and dislikes and all of that, and that becomes who I am. That's an important teaching. Also from our Vedantic text, the Ashtavakra Samhita, this important verse, Muktabhimani muktohi baddho baddhabhimanyapi Kim vadanti satyayam yamati sagatir bhavet. One who considers him or herself to be free is free indeed, whereas one who considers him or herself as bound remains bound. As one thinks, so one becomes, is a popular saying in the world, and it is quite true. This is very important. How we think of ourselves determines much. Our identity determines our experience. So in spiritual life, we can change the thoughts we have about ourselves. Take them to a more universal principles. Start thinking of ourselves not just as bodies and as mothers or as sons and as doctors or as janitors or whatever, but as spirit. Yes, as consciousness. We have to re-image our identity. We start thinking, I am free. Vedanta comes back again and again to this idea, you are not your body. And we know it. We've all studied enough Vedanta to know, yes, I'm not my body, I'm not my body. And yet, it's so hard to go beyond that. We say, yes, I am not the body, I am also not the mind, I'm not my mind, I'm not even my ego, I am infinite consciousness and bliss. We can say it, but the next moment someone cuts us off on the freeway and we're ready to show some obscene gestures or something. Right? Why is it so hard to go beyond these? Just saying so is not so helpful. Just to say, I'm not the body, I'm not the body, I'm not the body. All our experiences are mediated through this body. All our experiences. And they're so strong, it feels so real. The pleasure, say the pleasure of eating a of fresh croissant with Darjeeling tea, as I did this morning for breakfast. It's pleasurable. We like it. It's very enjoyable. It feels so real and so vivid. Or maybe we're walking too fast and we stub our toe against the chair of a leg. Oh, it hurts so much. The leg of a chair, thank you very much. We stub our toe against the leg of a chair, and it hurts a lot. It's really painful. It feels very real. So how do I say I'm not this body when I feel that so strongly? Even Sri Ramakrishna, he broke his arm or dislocated the shoulder or something. We're not quite sure what the nature of the injury was, but his arm was in a sling for about 6 weeks, and it hurt. And he complained. He was complaining to the Divine Mother, "Mother, my arm is broken. Why is my arm broken?" Afterwards, of course, he understood there was a deeper meaning to it. He said that this was to destroy the very last vestige of egotism, to pull it up by the very roots, so that he would be fully surrendered to the Divine Mother, and only the Mother would be acting through him. And at the same time, it also brought his mind down from the absolute, from his always merging in infinite consciousness, to be aware of this world so he could teach us. So these two ideas. So I think we need to be a little careful about denigrating our bodies, or constantly saying, "I'm not the body," when, in fact, we are strongly identified with it. And perhaps we also hold a lot of tension in our bodies. It's going to be very difficult to transcend our bodies if they give us a lot of pain, or if we hold tension or trauma. A lot of childhood trauma is held in the body. And so for a beautiful example was a man, Gerald Jampolsky, who wrote about this. He had tremendous back pain. And he went to doctors after doctors, and it couldn't heal. They couldn't figure out what was wrong, and they proposed surgery. They couldn't really help him. And then he looked at the relationship he had with his father, and he worked on that, and he worked on that, and he was finally able to forgive his father for whatever painful experiences had happened in his childhood, and the back pain cleared up. So I think there's another way. The danger of saying I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, is, and this is a very nice term I recently learned, though I heard now later that it's been around since the 1970s, called spiritual bypassing. Spiritual bypassing. We have certain problems in our lives. Maybe we never ironed out the conflict with our mother. And we say, "Oh, I'm above that. I'm spiritual now. I'm going to rise above it." And yet, actually, we haven't risen above it. We've pushed it down, we've repressed it, and it manifests as some back pain, or as some compulsion to shop, or whatever. And actually, it's because of that unresolved conflict we had in our families. So, this is called spiritual bypassing. This is a danger. Rather, let us face the conflicts, resolve them, and then we can actually let them go. Then we can let the body go. Then we can rise above the body. And anger is a perfect example. We know that anger is unhelpful. It's a big obstacle in spiritual life. So maybe we feel angry. Well, anger is bad. I shouldn't feel angry. We start to feel guilty for feeling angry, or we push it down. We pretend we're not angry. We pretend that we're fine because we're spiritual, and spiritual people don't get angry. Everybody gets angry. Spiritual people also get angry. Even Sri Ramakrishna got angry. Once he arranged for a coach to come pick him up and take him somewhere, and the man never showed. And he paid ahead of time, and the man never showed up. And he said, "It made me very angry." So even Sri Ramakrishna would get angry, and we're not going to get angry? All right, we get angry. the important thing is not to get swept away by our anger. It doesn't mean we're going to express our anger in nasty words or in throwing things or any of that. It means, all right, we're angry, we recognize it, we acknowledge it, we try to resolve it, we try to let it go, genuinely let it go, not repress it. So maybe societal injustice makes us angry. Then maybe what we need to do is work to address injustice. Maybe we need to work to, if that's our path, that may be where we need to point our energies. Moreover, where is the boundary between spirit and matter? Where is the boundary between our mind and our body? If we're constantly saying, I'm not the body, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, we actually set up a kind of a dualism. We set up a dualism, whereas looking at the mind and body, they're intimately connected. As these examples of the back pain show, they're intimately connected. So I'm not sure how helpful it is to set up this strong dualism. Rather, the body and the mind arise in me, in the infinite consciousness which I am, actually from the Vedantic standpoint. But what may be more helpful for us as a start is to look on our bodies as a temple of the Spirit, a temple for our true self, our true divine self. Rather than negating it, recognize it as a temple. And then we treat, naturally we treat a temple with respect, and we treat we feed a temple good, healthy, nutritious food, and we give it enough rest, and we start to recognize that the other people's bodies are also temples. So we start to treat others with respect also. If we look at Sri Ramakrishna and his body, it's quite interesting. He also had a body. He was embodied just like we are. And how the joy of spiritual life manifested through his body, the joy of spiritual experience, how did it manifest through his body? Tears would flow from the outer corners of his eyes. All the hairs of his body would stand on end as he experienced the thrill of divine communion. He would dance, and his dance was a glorious expression of divinity. I'd like to read a short description of his dancing from Swami Sarada Devi, from Sri Ramakrishna, the great master. Dancing under the influence of spiritual emotions, he was now proceeding, now receding with a rapid step to the timing of the music. He seemed like a fish swimming about in great delight in a sea of bliss. Each movement of his limbs clearly indicated it. But it is impossible to give expression to the wonderful manifestation of that fully natural and unrestrained power of bliss, where beauty and tenderness had blended together in a sweet harmony. We have witnessed many beautiful dances full of gesture by both male and female dancers, but never did we have a glimpse of that happy synthesis of power and beauty, as we did in the unrestrained and yet perfectly balanced dance of the Master, when he lost himself in the divine moods of spiritual emotions, when his body, overflowing with the intense joy of divine feelings, swayed to and fro in quick steps. One seriously wondered whether it was made of any solid physical substance at all. One felt as if waves, mountain high, rose in a sea of bliss and were going forward, carrying everything before them, and would merge that very moment, liquid in liquid, and vanish out of sight. So Sri Ramakrishna expressed his ecstasy through his body. He didn't sit, of course there were times when he sat inert and completely transcended his body. But when he was in his body, it full of grace and delicate, so delicate, every movement expressing his being an instrument of the Divine Mother, the divine manifesting through his body and his mind and his speech. Oh, it's a beautiful example for us. Another fascinating story, Swami Vivekananda. How did he look on his body? In New York, one of his early disciples, Miss Waldo, who played a big role in Swami Vivekananda's his message, you can say, she took down the notes of his talks in Thousand Island Park, and she also took dictation for the book Raja Yoga. So early in her discipleship, she had met a lot of spiritual teachers, and she observed them very carefully, and they always fell short. They always came up as having some defect or other. So she was worried that she would see the same in Swamiji, that he would somehow fall short. And so she was nervous about that. And they were in New York, in one of the brownstone buildings where the Vedanta Society was started. And in those buildings, held on the first floor, I'm reading now from Sister Devamata. Those brownstones held on the first floor a long, narrow drawing room with high folding doors at one end, two large windows at the other, and between them a mirror reaching from floor to ceiling. So there was this big mirror in the room. This mirror seemed to fascinate the Swami. He stood before it again and again, gazing at himself intently. In between, he walked up and down the room, lost in thought. Miss Waldo's eyes followed him anxiously. Now the bubble is going to burst, she thought. He is full of personal vanity. So she thought, oh my God, even Swami Vivekananda, who seems like such a great teacher, but he's very vain. He's staring at himself in the mirror. He's full of vanity. Suddenly he turned to her and said, Ellen, it is the strangest thing. I cannot remember how I look. I look and look at myself in the glass, but the moment I turn away, I forget completely what I look like. This is how an illumined soul thinks of his body. He doesn't. He couldn't form a picture of his own image in the mirror. Seeing it, he recognized, oh, that's me, of course, but when his mind was too pure, too much immersed in divinity. So this identity of ours, which we think is so permanent and which we hold on to so strongly, we can remind ourselves that every day, when we lie down and go to sleep, we completely forget all about it. That identity which we hold so dear, every day, we completely forget all about it and let go of it completely. And then we start having a dream, and we get a dream identity, which is only loosely based on our waking identity. We may have all kinds of powers that we didn't have, or may have strange bodies which do things which our waking bodies can't do, like fly or breathe underwater, or all those kind of things. It's a completely different identity. In our waking life, if we are spiritual seekers, we really will have to take up this project of re-imaging our identity, refocusing our identity from all these roles that we play to a spiritual conception of ourselves. Form that identity according to spiritual principles. And this, of course, we've talked about the process of negation, saying I'm not the body, and I suggested that that's not so helpful as to take the positive approach, to affirm the spiritual principle that I am true, I am pure consciousness, I am spirit, I am a child of God. I think meditation is very helpful in this process of re-imaging our identity. Why? When we meditate, at least in our tradition, how are we taught to meditate? We're generally taught to meditate on our chosen ideal, our Ishta Devata. And our chosen ideal, be it Krishna or Rama or Buddha or Jesus or Ramakrishna, different manifestations of divinity, we are taught to envision our chosen ideal, or Kali or Durga or Shiva. We're taught to vision our chosen ideal as seated in our heart. And this is important, facing the same direction that we're facing. Seated here, facing this way. The heart. When we talk about ourselves, where do we point? I've been to Raleigh. I've been there. Yeah, I've been there. Yeah, how about you? I've been there. We point here. This is a clue. The seat of our identity is found here. Isn't it? Maybe. So, as we meditate on the chosen ideal seated here, gradually the chosen ideal drives out that limited ego which is sitting here, that limited ego who we think we are, and our true identity starts to shine here. So there's a deep meaning to it. How fortunate we would have been to have a mother like Queen Madalasa from the ancient stories of India. Swami Vivekananda points out, there was once a Hindu queen who so much desired that all her children should attain freedom in this life, that she herself took all the care of them. By a queen, she could have had the nurses and nannies look after the children. She herself took care of them, and as she rocked them to sleep, she sang always the one song to them, Tattvamasi, Tattvamasi, thou art that, thou art that. From infancy, she raised them with this idea, you are that infinite consciousness and bliss. You are pure divinity. And it's put in Sanskrit also. I think this is the Markandeya Purana. I've forgotten now. Shuddho sire tatana testi nama Kritam hitat kalpana yadhanaiva Vajjatmakam dehamidam natesti Naivasya tamaro-dishi kanya-heto. My child, you are ever pure. You do not have a name. A name is only an imaginary superimposition on you. This body made of 5 elements is not you, nor do you belong to it. This being so, what can be the cause of your tears? Why are you crying? So we are not so fortunate, perhaps, that we had a mother like Queen Madalasa, so we have to do it ourselves. This idea of constant repetition, reminding ourselves who we are. Josephine MacLeod, also known as Tantine, Swami Vivekananda's friend, she called herself, thought of herself. He said about Swamiji that he used to make us realize there was nothing secular in life, it was all holy. He would tell us, always remember you are incidentally an American and a woman, but always a child of God. Tell yourself day and night who you are. Never forget it. That is what he used to tell us. Always remember, we are incidentally men or women, Americans or Indians or Indian Americans or American Indians, and incidentally we are doctors or nurses or engineers or carpenters or monks or mothers or fathers. Incidentally all these things, but always a child of God. I love this, incidentally. You are incidentally a girl and always a child of God. Yes. Vivekananda would say, for those who are, of course, attuned to the ideal of jnana, of wisdom, I think always I am Brahman. Every other thought must be cast aside as weakening. Cast aside every thought that says that you are men or women. Let body go, mind go, and gods go, and ghosts go. Let everything go but that one existence. Everything else must be thrown aside, and this is to be repeated continually, poured through the ears until it reaches the heart, until every nerve and muscle, every drop of blood tingles with the idea that I am he, I am he. Even at the gate of death, say, I am he. Oh, it's not that we won't still be daughters or sons or fathers and mothers and engineers and all those things, and art lovers and musicians and everything. We will be all those things, but incidentally. Not that we won't be Indian or American or black or white or brown, men, women, gay, straight, all those things, all right, incidentally. But we don't need to cling to that identity, because the locus of our me is shifting to something greater. Our true self, which is consciousness and bliss, shining behind everything. Swami Vivekananda once, he wrote to Mary Hale from the Gulf of Aden. He was in a ship going back to India, and he wrote, "Once more Asia. What am I? Asiatic, European, or American? I feel a curious medley of personalities in me." See how he puts it? I feel a medley of personalities in me. Actually, he's identified with something much greater. But still, in this world, we will have a personality, or maybe several personalities. Swamiji here feels all these personalities, an Asiatic personality, an American personality, a European personality. Yes, those personalities are all there. Let them be there. And yet, they're in me, but I am not them. I am not in them. So gradually, in this way of reminding ourselves and thinking in this way, we start to relinquish that death-like grip that we have on our limited identity. We start to expand it. Now, let's talk a little bit about the ego. This ego, which is that root sense of I, of ahankar, of the maker of the I. So Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda both tell us that the ego is the last obstacle to liberation, to full enlightenment, to illumination, to God realization. The ego is the obstacle. And Sri Ramakrishna would say again and again, all troubles come to an end when the ego dies. He puts it very simply and quaintly, charmingly in Bengali. He says, Ami gele, ghuchibe jonja. Ami gele. When the I goes, the Ami, the ego, we say when the ego dies, Ami gele. When the I goes away, this sense of I as being a separate person goes away, then all the troubles come to an end. But at the same time, he says, you can't get rid of it. On the one hand, he says, you have to transcend it, and on the other hand, he says, you can't get rid of it. It doesn't go. What happens when it goes? He gives this beautiful illustration, a very Vedantic illustration. He says, it's an infinite ocean of existence, consciousness, bliss, absolute. Satchidananda Sagar, an infinite ocean of bliss. And in that ocean, there's a pot. And that pot, there's a pot called I. A pot called I in that infinite ocean. So, of course, in the pot and outside the pot, same water. Same water. Now we're talking about the ocean of consciousness and bliss. So long as that pot remains, it is as though there are two separate masses of water. Two parts of water. The water inside the pot and the water outside the pot. But if the pot is broken, what remains? Just one infinite expanse of water. Shard, those sink to the bottom. So that also you can't even talk about it. Who's going to talk about it? That part of I who was there to describe it is gone. So who's to talk about it? Yet in the case of people like us, ordinary people, the I never fully goes away. Sri Ramakrishna likens it to a tree, an ashwatha tree. You cut it down. Next day what happens? The shoot's coming up. So the I, the ego is like that. It doesn't want to go away. It's so persistent. He puts it in Bengali, he puts it so charmingly. Ami kono mote jete chai na. By no way does the I agree to go. It doesn't want to go. It just doesn't. There's no way to make it go. So, what does he say? He likens it to a fruit, say a mango. A mango hanging on a tree, when it's forming, it forms into a beautiful green egg-like fruit, right? But at first it's hard. And if you pick it at that time, you'll find it's hard to pick. It's hard to pull it off the tree, and you might even damage the tree. You might pull off a twig of the tree also. And what happens if you taste it? Sour. Hard and sour. Not very tasty. Except for a few people from south of India where they like sour mangoes. But those people accepted, we think, sour mango. We don't enjoy it. It's hard. If you throw it at someone, it'll hurt. All right? Now, what happens when it ripens? When it ripens, it becomes soft and tender. And you just have to tug on it a little and it'll come right off the tree. And you taste it, so sweet, so delicious, juicy, wonderful. It's the same fruit, but it's been ripened. So he says, ripen your ego. Ripen your identity, really, is what he's saying. If this ego cannot be got rid of, he says, then let the rascal remain as the servant of God. Jodi ekanto ami najas, takshala, das ami hoye. He used to use that language, a little bit rustic language we can say. Let that rascal remain. Huh? That I, it's okay, it's a rascal, but let him or let her remain. How? As the servant, as the devotee, as the child of God. That Swamiji was telling Josephine MacLeod. Remind yourself always you are a child of God. That's how we ripen our ego. He says, such a person feels either that he is a servant of God or a lover of God. The servant ego, the knowledge ego, or the devotee ego may be called the ripe ego. Then he shows us the pitfalls of the unripe ego. He says, the unripe ego makes one feel, I am the doer. I am the son of a wealthy man. I am learned. I am rich. How dare anyone slight me? A man with an unripe ego cherishes such ideas. And then he goes on to point out the trouble of the ego of old age. An old man, or we can put an old woman, has many shackles: caste, pride, shame, hatred, and fear. Furthermore, he is bound by the ideas of worldly cleverness, calculating intelligence, and deceit. If he is angry with anybody, he cannot shake it off easily. Perhaps he keeps the feeling as long as he lives. Again, there is the ego of scholarship and the ego of wealth. The ego of old age is an unripe ego. This we see in someone who has never done any spiritual practice. And the older we get, that ego, that sense of self, it becomes harder and harder to change, and it becomes more and more irritable. You know, the angry old man? Yeah, like that. It's very sad. But I don't know anybody like that here amongst this present company, because we're all spiritual seekers. We have all been working on ripening our egos, on softening them. And so we see the fruits. So it's beautiful to see someone who has attained that stage of a ripe ego. The gentleness, the love, the readiness to serve. It's beautiful to see that when that comes. Since this I must remain, let the rascal be God's servant. I and mine, these constitute ignorance. My house, my wealth, my learning, my possessions. The attitude that prompts one to say such things comes of ignorance. On the contrary, the attitude born of knowledge is, O God, thou art the master, and all these things belong to thee. House, family, children, attendants, friends are thine. When the ego is fully ripe, like the mango, it drops off the tree of its own accord. So that's how do we transcend the ego? Not by brute force. We transcend it by transforming it, by ripening it, and gradually it drops off the tree of itself. Now when the ego goes, what happens to us? Who am I then? When the pot breaks, what happens to me? There's only one infinite ocean. What happens to me as me? Some people may feel a little frightened. No, when we say, when the pot breaks, there is just one infinite expanse of ocean. Well, what about me? People used to express this concern to Swami Vivekananda. He would teach the teachings of non-duality, of Advaita Vedanta, and people would say, well, but what will happen to my individuality? I won't exist anymore. And he would ridicule that. Ida Ansel remembers, he playfully ridiculed the question, what becomes of one's individuality when one realizes one's oneness with God? You people in this country are so afraid of losing your individuality, he would exclaim. Why? You are not individuals yet. When you realize your whole nature, you will attain your true individuality. Not before. In knowing God, you cannot lose anything worth having. You cannot lose anything worth having. And he asks a very good question. He points out, if we're afraid of losing our individuality in spiritual realization, well, which state is my individuality, he asks. When I was a baby, sprawling on the floor, trying to swallow my thumb? Was that the individuality I should be sorry to lose? Be glad we've lost that individuality. 50 years hence, I shall look upon this present state and laugh, just as I now look upon the baby state. Which of these individualities shall I keep? If we look at the verses, the words expressed by the illumined souls, say, take the Viveka Chudamani, the crest jewel of discrimination of Shankaracharya. There he describes the experience of the seeker when he realizes his true identity, when he awakens to his true identity as the infinite consciousness and this. And what does he say? Interestingly, he still uses the word I. And yet, he says, I am not this, I am not that, I am infinite. Asangoham, anangoham, alingoham, abhanguraha, prashantoham, anantoham, amaloham, chirantanaha, akartaham, abhoktaham, avikaroham, akriyaha, Shuddha bodha svarupoham kevaloham sadashivaha. So you keep hearing this aham, 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 I. He's saying I. I am unattached. I am disembodied. I am free from the subtle body and undecaying. I am serene. I am infinite. I am taintless and eternal. I am not the doer. I am not the enjoyer. I am changeless and beyond activity. I am the essence of pure knowledge. Shuddha bodha swarupoham. I am absolute and identified with eternal good. Fascinating. Here the language is both negation and affirmation, as we've talked about. Realizing, I'm not all those things I thought I was. I am infinite. I am utterly pure. I am the vast as the sky. So it's wonderful, thrilling verses really, thrilling verses to read and contemplate our destiny. Well, I better wrap it up. Let's close with this story of Swami Vivekananda's. He says, you may remember perhaps the old Persian story of how a lover came and knocked at the door of the beloved and was asked, who are you? And he answered, it is I. And there was no response. Again, a second time, he came and exclaimed, I am here, but the door was not open. The third time he came, and the voice asked from inside, who is there? He replied, I am thyself, my beloved. And the door opened. So is the relation between God and ourselves. He is in everything, he is everything. Every man and woman is the palpable, blissful, living God. Who says God is unknown? Who says he is to be searched after? We have found God eternally. We have been living in him eternally. Everywhere he is eternally known, eternally worshipped. So I hope I have been able to give some idea today of, we talked about identity and its importance in spiritual life. How we think of ourselves affects our whole experience in this world and also determines the course and progress of our spiritual life. And we also discussed the importance of having a strong and stable sense of self first, and then ripening that and ultimately transcending it. But we start with a healthy ego and then we transcend it. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. And may we all remember our true identity, which is in the divine, which is not other than the divine, which is of the nature of infinite consciousness and bliss, and be happy, and help others to be happy. And Om Tat Sat. Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Mritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. From the unreal, lead us to the real. From darkness, lead us unto light. From death, lead us to immortality. Om peace, peace, peace. I'll be here tonight. We'll have meditation at 6 p.m., Arati at 7, and then tonight we'll read a little from the letters of Swami Vivekananda. Informally, read and discuss. That'll be tonight. And then tomorrow morning I'll be going to Tennessee for a week. I'll be back the following Sunday. We'll have Guru Purnima Puja at 6 p.m. And we'll probably have some music and a little discussion of Guru and all of that. And followed by Prasad. And then Monday and Tuesday I'll be here. We'll have meditation and Arati both nights at 6 p.m. and 7 p.m. respectively. And then 7:30, on Monday, we'll talk about Upanishadic meditation. We'll do some meditation on verses from the Upanishads. And on Tuesday, I will be speaking on the All-Blissful Mother as our topic. So we hope to see some of you in the coming days. And I'm glad you could come. And don't forget, this is your center. This is a place for spiritual satsang, means gathering together to support our spiritual lives. and to invite also monks and nuns from time to time who can give the classes here and encourage us on our spiritual life. And as the center grows, we'll watch the unfolding of something beautiful, I'm sure. There's the Arati every evening at 7, isn't it? And if you want to be a part of that, you can come, or you can even volunteer to dedicate one night per week to do that, so that the daily worship is maintained. And that helps maintain the sanctity of the shrine. Where we worship, where we pray together, the divine manifests there a little more. So why do we feel when we come here that this is a living shrine? Why do we feel like this is a holy place? Because every day we do worship here. Every evening we do an arati here. So may Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother Sarada Devi bless us, that we may not go forward and not stop till the goal is reached.